Hello and welcome to Tech Bugs and Rock and Roll, a weekly live stream video podcast about everything that's happening in the wonderful world of software, technology, the web, music, AI, the web, AI, the web, AI, music. Did we mention AI? Now, my regular co-host Mark Rendell is in Utrecht right now at Azure Lowlands, so please welcome our special guest host for this week, Kevlin Henney.
Hello, glad to be here. Glad to be a stand-in Mark as opposed to a stand-up Mark.
So how are things in your world, Kevlin? What have you been up to the past week or so?
Well, okay, there's obviously an exchange thing going on here because I was in the Netherlands just within the last week, but not Utrecht. I was in Rotterdam. I was at the Joy of Code, which I believe you were at last year.
I was at last year.
Yeah,
which is it's a fun event, that isn't it? With same format, single track, so it's just one day. And I was there last year, and it's one of those lovely events. You know, I love all kinds of technology events, but the one day, one track format is great because by the end of the day, everyone has seen all the same stuff. So you can chat to anybody. You know, you go and have a drink afterwards, and you know that all the folks who are there, they all watched all the same things, and it's also with the sort of, you know, multi-track, because we've done the Beauty of Code as opposed to Joy of Coding in Malmo in Sweden a couple of times, which is the same format. It does have that thing of, you know, on the one hand, it's great because everyone has kind of seen the same stuff. On the other hand, if you are presenting, you sort of have to watch all the other sessions because you don't want to get up and make it obvious that you've been in your hotel dealing with calls all day while everyone else has been hearing all these other things that you now are blissfully unaware of. So, what were you talking about at Joy of Coding? What was the?
So that's the thing. It's exactly as you say. You've got to be aware. Unless you are the first speaker, you have to absolutely be tuned into what everybody else is saying, because there's no kind of excuse of like, actually, I was catching a deadline or catching 40 winks, it was a different track, so I didn't see that. There's no excuse. This is like there is one track. You're either it's zeros and ones. You were either there or you weren't. So you've got that. They got me to do a meetup the night before, and they got me to do a talk at the end of the day, as well. So that's great. I can basically drink as much as I want at the speaker, you know, because I've got a full day to recover as long as I'm present for all of the talks. But that said, I'm going to say there is another. Another benefit to the single track is if you do go to the speaker dinner, you get to meet all of the speakers. You are you're there, and you get a lot closer. You get the conversations can be much deeper, much weirder, much nerdier. You find the common ground more rapidly, and so that was great. But it is kind of full on in that sense. But by the time, as I was the last speaker, I had to watch everything because and it was actually quite interesting how interwoven and interconnected all the talks were when you looked at it the right angle. In fact, I got to the point where, halfway through the afternoon, I said to somebody, if people didn't know that we hadn't, they would suspect that as speakers, we'd all got together and sort of said, okay, we're going to create some common threads. You know, I'll toss this bat onto you, you pick it up in your talk. And then, you know, it did feel a little bit like that. So I was talking about technical neglect. And that's something that as a metaphor that I kind of coined a couple of years ago. And because I just found that the discussions around technical debt were kind of missing the point, although it was not a bad metaphor, they were kind of missing the point. So I started using this term. I said the thing that people are complaining about is not actually the debt, or that's not the root cause. So I started talking about this. So they wanted me to talk about not exactly technical debt, but refactoring. They got in touch with me and said, could you do this refactoring talk? Yeah. And it's just like, I'm talking about technical neglect now, so I'll weave that in. But yeah, very much refactoring is more than just a key click, and it's not a sprint. It's a design thing. So that's the thing. It was a big tent discussion. I could have. So therefore, it was naturally going to connect with everybody's. But they gave me an hour, which is incredibly dangerous because some speakers had 30 minutes, some speakers had 40 minutes, and they gave me an hour at the end of the day. And it's just like, I can do a lot with an hour, and I still not have enough time. But that was an absolute blast. Yeah, fully intense. Rotterdam. turned out to have some great weather for most of the time, except it was raining the day we were doing the talks, which was absolutely fine. So
I always think that the ideal weather for a conference is you want it to be cold and miserable the days when you have to be inside, and then you want it to brighten up on the days when you can be outside. When I was there last year, we did my partner Claire came along with me, and we did you can do a boat tour of Rotterdam Harbour, the port, which is the largest, maybe the largest in the world, certainly the largest in Europe, industrial container port. And you're just on this nice big boat with, voiceovers in 3 languages and narration, watching these astonishing container ships just kind of, getting unloaded. And the whole thing is automated on a scale that is unbelievable. Really, really interesting stuff. Yeah. But so I just want to go back to something you mentioned there, which was about technical neglect. Because, technical debt is this sort of lovely idea that I think everybody gets wrong, because I think that the analogy misses the fundamental property of financial debt is that you can erase it like that if somebody gives you the money. And, that's the thing. I think the idea of technical debt was that it was, my interpretation certainly, is to get people to think about the cost of servicing a decision you made. Just like, if you borrow money, then every month you have to pay interest, and that becomes part of your operating model now. But, with finance, you can turn around and go, yeah, you know what? Someone just gave us a big fat check. The debt is gone. Boom. And with code, that's not possible. There is not that sort of restructuring. The debt is not debt. And I like the phrase technical neglect you used there.
Yeah, I think it's, I think the thing you say, it's important that the debt, I mean, this is actually something I wrote about a few years ago. I sort of said, okay, there's no metaphor that will be perfect, because it's a metaphor. Because if it were perfect, then it wouldn't be a metaphor. It would be the thing. It would be identity. But the point is that a good metaphor is something that has enough the right points of correspondence, not too many of the wrong ones, but is also familiar to the target audience. So if you use a metaphor that is unfamiliar, the whole point of a metaphor is, hey, here's a complex, weird, abstract thing, and I'm going to explain it in terms of this thing you already understand or find simple, and I'm going to create a mapping. If I say, here's a complex abstract thing that you're really not understanding, I'm going to use another complex abstract thing that you don't understand to explain this. So I'm going to have to explain that. And you sometimes get that when people throw out metaphors. Everybody understands some concept of debt. So we're on widespread. But then the whole set of trade-offs, and that was the original formulation. So we're trying to kind of discuss the trade-offs and understand that debt buys you something, but it also incurs interest, and it can sort of be restructured. Oh, that's dead code. Well, we've written that off. That's fantastic. The debt in that code base does not count because we've actually retired that system. That's fantastic. So it's got a lot of good points, but then everybody then equated it with all debt is bad. Which was not the original vision that Lord Cunningham had in mind. He was basically saying, like, well, you want to buy something now, but you can't afford it. So, you can do it now and then repay it. And then he said, it can buy you an advantage. You're not supposed to run it up like it's like the taxi driver. For those of you who've not taxi driver, but airplane, the taxi driver in Airplane. Some of you will know this reference, but it was one of the first post-credit scenes for films. An Airplane is 1979. People weren't doing post-credit. We've been, Marvel made us all used to that idea, but this was one of the first ones. We don't leave the meter running, and a lot of people do that. And the neglect thing is really interesting because it's just like, it's not the debt, it's where did the debt come from, and it's the kind of like, it's unmanaged debt. It's a thing we didn't do. It's not a thing we do. You don't write debt. It doesn't get created normally maliciously, the unmanaged stuff. It just happens because we didn't do something else. Neglect is the thing we didn't. That's why it's so hard to see. So that's why I kind of push into that one.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting idea. And one of those, the whole idea of code maintenance, you mentioned dead code there. And I've built systems where the ability to trivially delete a lot of dead code is actually in and of itself a very expensive thing to maintain, because it leads you down sort of, an architectural approach of a lot of, we'll put this in a new project. So on .NET, certainly, which is the platform I'm probably most familiar with, you can have projects, and a project compiles into its own DLL. And so those are binary deployable units. And if you decide you don't want one anymore, you just delete the project. And that's easy. But then you talk to these people who are like, you've got 27 projects in this, and this is a monolithic website. Like, there's no distributed deployment here. All of this goes onto the same server, or the same image, the same instance. And they're like, yeah, but we wanted to keep things separated. And so now every time anyone on that team builds the solution, they're building 27 projects that could be one project. And so you have this balance, the most difficult balance in software is how much pain and friction are we going to introduce to every day of our working lives in case we need it later?
Yeah, and that oh my goodness, there's so much unmanaged debt in that space. And that's the funny thing, is that people will, there's a lot of what ifs, because but the one I always counter people is, people go, well, what if we need to do this? And what if you don't? How much have you actually paid? And actually, that's the interesting thing. The money metaphor comes back, and that you're exactly what you're describing. I had years ago. There was one team that was just like, yeah, we partitioned everything. They had a nice logical partitioning of packaging and everything. And I looked at that. Oh yeah, this is really good. And then they said something. It's just, and we've made this all generate separate DLLs. So I said, the one-to-one logical to physical mapping might be a problem. And you've basically got these your fragmented things that you've now got to rebuild, redeploy. Everything needs to be managed separately, and it's just like, maybe we could reduce the number. And we actually reduced it down to 5, which was the logical kind of thing. It was not some crazy 2-digit number. There were 5 things, and that was great. And these days,
a comment from Origami Marie: you've got to make sure the positive interest is going to outrun the negative interest. This is financial arbitration is basically borrowing money because you think you can turn that money into more money faster than the people you borrowed it from will turn it into more debt. And then when you pay them back, you win. And, the whole point, I think, about technical debt is that it's not just about positive interest. It's about actually revenue. It's about, you assume some liability, but that gives you the ability to sell something. But, and going back to metaphors, so something else that occurred to me while you were saying that was, to me, I think the most enduring metaphor in software is about construction and buildings, and we have architects, and we talk about build processes and all this kind of stuff. And that one works brilliantly until you explain to someone that construction, they get to build a bridge, and then they get to build another bridge, and then they get to build another bridge, and the decision making is the little few details of this bridge that can't be exactly the same as the old one, because otherwise they just get to do the same thing over and over and over and over, and so they get good at it. And we don't do that because you can copy and paste software. And, imagine if every copy of Microsoft Word was written by hand just for you, by engineers. They'd get really good at writing Microsoft Word because they just do it from scratch every day.
It'll be a performance. You could say, I'm going to go to the evening performance of Word. Oh, look at them go. It's just like, I'm going to say that line was written better than it was last night. Last night's performance. But I think it's interesting because the construction one is that the specifically the one you're describing is the one I always talk about in terms of manufacturing as the metaphor, and I always it's a case of and again, some of these things, the build process, we use it as well with pipelines and all the rest of it. We've got the language of manufacturing, and the problem is that in software development we kind of solve the manufacturing problem like really near the beginning. It's just like, okay, we're going to build a thing, and now you want to build another thing that's identical. Well, that's kind of easy. Do you not want something different? And manufacturing is exactly about the elimination of variation. In fact, I've got an example. Yes, I have an example. Awesome. Here I have 2 pens. They are seemingly identical. They were manufactured by the same company, and apart from their ink content at this point, which is a dynamic quality, they are, I keep ordering these pens. I've got variants in different colors, and these are my favorite, and I expect I'm going to get the same thing every time, and it's no additional effort. The marginal cost, whatever. That's the whole thing. Manufacturing is about the creation of the same thing, elimination of variation. What do we do in software? If somebody says, I want that system, which one? The one that's running over there. And what do you want with it? I want it running over there. Okay. Yeah. How many months is that going to take you? It's not, because that's the thing we do. It's just like we can move bytes there. We can copy bytes, or you want me to copy the source code. Again, an easy operation. If somebody recommends an app to me, I go to the I go to the store, and it's just like, I'll download that. I don't have to go and ask somebody. I want those. Software craft. I want those crafted ones and zeros. I want my ones and zeros of that. Nobody has to do that, And so we eliminated the manufacturing problem, which leaves us, unfortunately, with the problem of the exact opposite. People want variation. They don't want the same thing. They want the same thing but different. We want the new version of our product to be the same as the last version, except for, and then there's a list of change requests, or we want a rewrite. We've got this in Java. We want to move it to .NET. It's not the same. It really is very, very different. But there's a bits of it that are similar, but actually everything else, below the waterline is the same. Or our vendor, our competitor has this product, we want to have that feature as well. They're asking for a difference. So in other words, everything we do is about variation, not about similarity. We solved that problem. It's called a compiler. It's called a build system. So, we've done that. If you want the same thing, I'm going to put my feet up. We are done.
Control C, Control V. There you go. Now you have the same thing.
Yeah. Push.
And they're like, I want the same thing, but in blue. Yeah. So Stephen's just commented that he's having flashbacks to explanations to non-technical audiences of what source code is. So the one that I always reach for here is that source code is like a recipe, and you can get a pizza, you can order a pizza, but if you don't like the pizza, then you need to be able to modify it. And in order to modify the pizza, you need to know how it was made. And so you need the process. And compilers are basically very clever ovens that you give them the pizza recipe, and they will produce exactly that pizza every time. And if you want to change it, you just tweak the recipe and run it again. But then, like all the best analogies, this one works brilliantly right up until the point where it completely doesn't work.
I think that's the thing. Is I was just thinking that the whole thing with recipes is that I wanted to put a qualification in there. They're like recipes that you actually follow, because whenever I do occasionally, there's things I've learned to cook that I just wing, and I've learned kind of whatever. There's some things that I still follow, but whenever I do them, it's just like, you double the amount of garlic. That's not enough garlic. It's just that, and you do all of that. And we don't do that. That's not what source code does. There's the compiler is it's a source of determinism. In other words, it actually respects the recipe.
Yes.
But if you want that uncertainty, prompt engineering. If you want that uncertainty, I mean, yesterday when I wrote the prompt, in fact, 5 minutes ago when I wrote the prompt, it produced something else.
Yeah.
But now it's just like, So I'm going to just suggest that maybe prompt engineering is not going to be the way forward for actually, you want to version your prompts if you're going to do that. But at the same time, do recognize that's almost entirely worthless as a source of determinism. You will get unnecessary excitement if that becomes the thing.
You need to version your prompt, but also you need to version the entire context window that was in effect.
Oh,
and the version of the model that it was running on and all that kind of stuff. And actually, that leads us quite nicely. So one of the things that was on the board to chat about this week was there has been two things happen this week in the wonderful world of analytical inference, which is called AI, which is where you use numbers to predict what number comes next and then pretend that it's somehow intelligent. And so one of them, there's a couple of sites out there, Suno and Udio, which make music. And you can just go on and say, hey, give me 30 seconds of hillbilly bluegrass about a pelican called Brian, and it'll do it. And it will produce. And for me, the fascinating thing about sort of language model generated music is that you can, the way Markov chaining works. Yeah. Like every sentence is plausible, but it doesn't go anywhere. And there's no sense of continuity, there's no callbacks, there's just a sliding window of context. And certainly the versions that I've heard, and I hear a lot, because people keep sending me this stuff. And some people paste my lyrics into these things and then send me the thing it made. And for some reason, they think that this will make me happy and make me like them. And I don't entirely understand, If you want to make music,
it's a weird form of pebbling, you know.
Yeah.
It's for those who don't know what pebbling is. It's where you send memes and things to your friends, and it's basically named after penguins who will just simply offer pebbles to the one that they love and want to be associated with. It's just a tokenistic offering. It doesn't necessarily go deeper than that, and it's just a simple exchange.
The lovely thing. The lovely thing about pebbling, the detail about it that I think is lovely when penguins do it, is that they will just be happily penguining along one day along the beach, and then they'll see a pebble that to the human observers is just like every other pebble on the beach, and they'll pick it up and take it back to their mate and be like, hey, I thought you might like this pebble. And we have no idea why they choose that one.
Why that one? Yeah.
Honestly,
but I get the feeling that if I were visiting Earth as an alien, I'd be looking at some of the things that we do, and I'd be wondering almost the same thing. You know, it's a case of, you know, if I went to an old school record shop, and I remember doing this, I'm going to buy this record for my girlfriend. If I do that, and somebody else is like, well, he's got a piece of vinyl. That place is filled with pieces of vinyl that come in square things, and they all look pretty much the same. You know, you know, what's the deal with that? And you know, I can imagine, you know, being a non-penguin, you know, I'm looking at that pebble going like, clearly I am the alien here. I have no idea what the intrinsic qualities of that are, but you know, whatever works for you, mate.
So, but anyway, so to go back to the story, the music industry has declared war on artificial intelligence because the sort of big conglomerate, so this is Universal Music, it's Warner Brothers, it's Sony, it's the recording industry, all the people who declared war on Napster and, you know, have been sort of at the front line of this battle to regulate and, you know, pick whichever side in this you like. The mechanics of it are what I think is interesting because they are seeking $150,000 per work infringed. And this is what I think is fascinating about it because, you know, there's so an interesting thing that's happened recently is the band De La Soul have finally made it onto streaming. It took about 20 years for them to get there because they used samplers extensively. A lot of their compositions, they use drum breaks and they use, you know, horn samples and snippets of dialogue and all this kind of stuff. And they cleared it. They meticulously cleared the rights to use every one of those samples, but the clearance contracts that they signed did not cover digital distribution because no one knew what that was in 1989. It wasn't a thing. And so they get into this gray area where it's like, well, we've authorized to use it in videos and on TV and on vinyl and on cassette and on compact disc. But, what about Spotify? What about Apple? And so it's taken like another 15 years of wrangling, and I think a couple of them they actually had to change. But that's a known quantity. Like you can listen to a De La Soul track and you'll be like, oh, it's that drum break, it's that horn part, it's that look. So there's 5 people we need to talk to.
Yeah. And that's the thing is that sometimes with sampled things, you're sitting there. If you're the right kind of listener, you're sitting there going, like, "Oh, I know where that comes from," and you feel good about it. You know, it's got a well-defined content. Or you go, "I don't know where that comes from. But it clearly comes from a place."
Yeah, but there's a sort of finite number. Now you take a piece of music generated by, you know, one of these AI websites, and you think, how many, let's pretend for a second, because this is probably true, but I cannot substantiate it, and so it is purely an allegation at this point, that they have actually trained their model on every single song they could get their hands on. They've slurped everything on Spotify, everything on Apple Music, everything on, you know, somebody's collection of MP3s or whatever. And so all of this material is in there, and all of it has contributed to the vectors and the weightings that form part of the network that drives the model. So when that then spits out a piece of music, you know, does that 30-second clip constitute a derivative work of everything in the training model data set? Or is there some angle where they could be like, well, actually, these are the 17,000 songs that contributed vector weights to the model that was used to generate that particular output. You know, and 150,000 per work infringed. You imagine, you know, Warner Brothers going to these people going, well, you trained it on our entire catalog, which is, I don't know, 1 billion songs. So you owe us $150,000 times 1 billion. Because that's how many works you have infringed copyright on by training your model. You know, it's bizarre to think of the
But
you know,
yeah, it is bizarre until you say who's driving it. And there are, so in other words, there's a lot of issues here, and there's masses of copyright issues that are just being trodden over. But that specific claim, that's astonishing. $150,000, and you're thinking, well, hang on. I get the idea that this is not necessarily fair use copyright, and there's but then you leap from that to $150,000. How did that happen? Lawyers. Because that's who's actually driving. Because there's a speculative aspect to all large organizations, and they treat it like we were talking about finance earlier on, and the whole idea of it's almost derivatives. It's a highly speculative, probability based thing. It's just like, well, if we took this to court, what's the probable outcome? Well, it's probably not going to be 150,000. Well, let's go high on the possibility that, in other words, it's a case of and they've got a battery of lawyers going like, well, there's probably this case and that. We might be able to wangle something, and you've got the finance people going, on balance, if we lose this, then it's relative. If we win this, then it's absolutely huge. And so looked at from that point of view, it starts making a lot more sense as an individual who just lives in the world, listens to music, and knows a couple of things about a couple of these things. You go like, that's a ridiculous amount of money. Why would they come up with that? No, it's because they've run the numbers and the probabilities.
So Marie's commented, imagine a movie constructed of thousands of individual stolen cells. And the interesting thing here is that
are we talking about clones?
Cells, CEL, guessing animation cells. I mean, we're not quite up to cloning yet, so. But this is so. The doctrine on fair use and copyright is expressed as a sort of percentage of the size of the total work. But I'm presuming, and I am not a lawyer. I'm nothing close to a lawyer, but I'm presuming that there must be an element here that the rest of the work has to have a substantial. Like, you couldn't just make a novel by taking 50 different excerpts and being, well, each one of these excerpts is 2%. So that's below the threshold for fair use. So, and I just put them all together, and you've made a novel without creating anything original.
So collage.
And I've actually, there's a guy called, I can't remember his name, Brendan somebody. He ran a design consultancy called Magnetic North for a while, and he created artworks by taking every frame of a movie and compressing it horizontally till it was 1 pixel wide, and then stacking all of those next to each other. And so you've got these lovely kind of really bizarre abstract artworks that would give you a sense. And, you watch a movie well, like I remember he did one with Star Wars, and you can clearly see the desert bits are yellow and brown, and then the space bits are black and white, and then the desert bit is yellow and brown, and then it goes kind of brown and green. You're like, they must have gone to a forest now. And that was, and obviously, no original content there. Every single pixel on that artwork has been created directly by manipulating a copyrighted Hollywood film, but to an extent that no one's going to see you and go, well, someone could just look at our picture instead of going and buying the movie.
So that's,
Brendan Dawes, that was him, yes.
Right. So there's a threshold, because, if we actually do, if I say, I'm going to use this pixel, I'm going to borrow it from this, place, I'm going to use a pixel from here, then that falls clearly below a threshold. But then when we start quoting, and what you were describing just put me in mind of, there's this wonderful paper by Robert Biddle, Angela Martin, and James Noble. I've just pulled it up on screen from 2003. And it's called No Name, Just Notes on Software Reuse. And the whole paper is on software reuse. And the whole paper is basically it's basically copy and paste. It's quotes. The whole paper on reuse is a number of different sections that quote other people. It reuses. I love the self-referentiality. The whole paper is basically I'm just flicking through it, and nothing is more than about a column. It's a few paragraphs each, and just flicking through it, we see Knuth, Constantine, Larry Constantine. We got Gates, we've got Ada Lovelace, we've got Alan Turing, and it just quotes bits and pieces. So the whole paper is built out of reusable parts, but nothing is so large that it hits. I think it's about 200. I think for quoting works, it's around 250 words. Having had to deal with this myself, it's around the 250 word mark, and so the whole paper is composed as a collage. It's based on reuse, and in one sense, it is an original result, but it is based on quoting other people, and it's kind of I love love the interplay of that one. But it's upfront and it acknowledges all of that.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, something where a human composer, curator, collager, whatever terminology you care to employ, has meticulously chosen and selected and trimmed and arranged the pieces, constitutes an original artwork, even if all of the component parts of it could be considered to be derivative. Because in that instance, I don't think that the output work is... to me, morally, that doesn't feel like a derivative work of any of the originals. Yeah. Because, you have to look very closely to see where the pieces came from. It's not sort of immediate. There was a Tim O'Reilly, as in O'Reilly Books, the animal books, wrote an article this week, which I thought was a very interesting perspective on all of this. And, one of the things that he highlights in that article is... the point of copyright is not and has never been to suppress the distribution of these things. It's to make sure that the creators get acknowledgement, and if there's money on the table, they get their share of it. Yeah. And, it pushes that to one of the interesting points that he makes there is that so an AI model that generates news summaries from social media is potentially depriving a human journalist of an opportunity to do journalism, where maybe something that summarizes the plot of a movie doesn't, because there's not so much original research and context involved in that. And, one of the things that he goes on to talk about is the possibility of machine learning models that don't just produce synthesized output, they actually tell you where it came from. And they tell you every single, piece of material or copyrighted work that contributed to that, so that in theory, the revenue can then flow back upstream. And this sort of got me thinking about something like, Suno or Udio. Imagine they spit out a song, and you train a model. You take copyrighted music from a reliable source where absolutely everything, where it came from, who wrote it, who acknowledges it, who owns the copyright. All that gets fed into the model, so every vector in that model is tagged with where it came from, and then you get it to make you a song, and then you say, right, who wrote that? Where did it come from? And you get this, there are 15,000 different copyrighted works that contributed to the synthesis of this. And, all right, well, let's share the royalties. This song has made $11, 11 divided by 15,000 people. And, you wonder how the economics are going to pan out. Because, one of the very interesting details that I discovered a while ago is Google's Google Wallet, the internal payment system. Do you know what their unit of currency is?
No.
It's called a micron.
I don't really... Okay, that's going to be very confusing for anybody who already works in STEM subjects. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. If you're using Google Wallet to calculate prices, you express prices in microns, which are millionths of a US dollar. And they do this because Google has they have such a high volume of low-value transactions for things like AdWords that you can't, like most companies would vanish in a series of rounding errors, because the revenue per activity, per click, per impression, per whatever, is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a cent. So they have to track them in microns so that they break down and then they add back up. And, you have a thing where somebody's like, well, we've generated 150 million machine-generated songs, and they made $1 each. But that's $150 million,
Yeah, and you don't want to lose it in the rounding error.
Yeah.
But just for anybody listening who's not sure about the other meaning of micron, it means a micrometer, which is a millionth of a meter.
Yeah.
So right here, I have 500,000 microns. Okay, 500,000 microns. That's not bad. I mean, Google, call me.
So for folks catching this on the podcast, Kevlin is holding up a 50 centimeter plastic ruler. Microns are very, very tiny. But the thing is that unit name is already taken. So I did not know that they called them that. I assume they must do something fractional. Yeah.
But But honestly, naming, it is really hard, isn't it?
It is. Well, you've either you got to choose a word from somewhere that already means something, or you make up a new one. And you make up a new one, and people laugh at you and go, "Ha, lol, why are developers so hard to communicate with? It's all jargon and this and that." And so you're like, well, all right, we won't call it contravariance. We'll call it... the one that bit me recently was interfaces in TypeScript, which are not the same as interfaces in any other language I've ever used an interface in, but they look superficially similar, and they're called the same thing. And that cost me a day.
But I find when communicating with people, that the word interface, and it's just like interface, just generally for the chemists out there, it kind of makes sense that it's the boundary between two things. That's great. And then we start talking about interface, and so then I'm talking about so the interface here, and then I need to say, and I don't mean language construct interface, I mean API interface, or because we use it everywhere. And then when we see it as a keyword, we think, I know this, and that's the thing that got you. I know this. No, you don't. You know a thing that's like it. But then there's the other point is that sometimes we do invent terms, and everybody laughs at them because they develop a jargon. Then 10 years later, they're using them. Contravariance
has entered the chat.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I remember half the things I remember being told, but late 90s and early 2000s, people sort of say, "Oh yeah, have you seen these text abbreviations people are using?" And I said, these are from the 1980s. These are from the 1980s and early 90s. These are the things we used to do online, and listed in some kind of hacker culture and hacker subculture and all the rest of it. These go back a long way. It's text speak. It's like there's a bunch of stuff that's happened since, but a lot of these things is like that didn't come from there. But also we're responsible for some terrible terms that get used, and people that generally have made their way out into business, which is sometimes slightly cringe. But anyway, that's another story. But let's talk about intellectual property, because you mentioned Tim O'Reilly saying the whole point of copyright was not to suppress things; it was to acknowledge. And actually, there's a parallel with the history of the patent. The patent. It originated, the whole idea started in Italy in the late 15th century. And the first patent was, I think, was granted to a guy called Brunelleschi, who was responsible for the design of the dome in Florence. And the whole premise was actually the purpose of the patent is these days we think of that as companies own this and they're hostile to each other, it's territorial. The whole original concept of the patent was to allow an idea to be used, to basically get it out into the world and acknowledge its source. But the idea was not to say you hold it and the one who dies with the most wins. It was actually to cause sharing and distribution of knowledge, but acknowledge its provenance. That was the whole idea. And it's kind of, when you look at that from the 21st century perspective, it's like, well, that's not what we do today with patents. It is quite different. But all of these intellectual property laws normally start or ideas started somewhere else with quite different intentions to how we interpret them today.
I mean, copyright in the music industry is one that is, it's fascinating looking at because law very seldom gets rewritten. It gets clarified and clarified and clarified and clarified. But no one ever wants to turn around and go, actually, that was wrong. Because if they do, then potentially decades of very expensive litigation would have to be redone. And copyright in music was... So originally when Edison invented the first recording devices, the idea that anyone would record music was laughable, because any self-respecting household had musicians. And why on earth would anyone want to listen to music from a wax cylinder? And, he envisaged that the wax cylinder recordings would be for recording, great statespeople making speeches, because that was special. And that was the sort of thing, you might have a collection of speeches in your library that you could put on and listen to, which I love. And so that was... Don't we all? That's like TED Talks, but 150 years ago. And then, when popular music started, the musicians themselves, generally nobody had any idea who they were. The writers would write the songs, and then they would sell the songs to, or license the songs to studios, and the studios would be like, let's make this one today. And so they'd get a couple of session players who were probably hanging around outside looking for work, put them in a studio, they'd record the song, it would get released, the songwriters would get the royalty and the credit, the musicians, would not be, they get paid for the day, and that was it. That was their contribution. They wouldn't even get listed on the, on the sleeve often. And a lot of songs, like, I cannot think of an example off the top of my head, but songs from the 50s and 60s, there would be half a dozen different recordings within the space of about a year, because the company who had bought the rights to the song would just keep re-recording it until one of them was a hit.
Our idea these days of they've covered that wasn't a thing. That wasn't the way people looked at that back then.
Yeah. Actually, do you know Beck, the musician, the guy who did?
Funny, I was about to mention Beck. I know what you were going to say. Yes, I do know Beck. So yeah, you say it, because I mentioned this to somebody last week by coincidence.
What was it called? Song Reader.
He was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, he released an album as sheet music with no recordings. So these are, Beck songs. This is a guy who's been Grammy nominated and had, MTV smash hits and everything. Brought out a new album that no one has any idea what it's supposed to sound like, because all we have is the sheet music. And so it is completely open to people performing their own interpretations and that kind of stuff, which I love. And I downloaded it. I found it online, and I downloaded it, which I probably wasn't supposed to do, but who's counting? And I was like, would it be fun to record one of these? And then I remembered that I can't read music, and that sort of...
Yeah, because I can't read music either. But now, I know who this conversation came up. We ended up talking about this. I was talking with Scott Ford at Joy of Coding last week.
Yeah.
And Scott runs. He does a podcast. It's a legacy code appreciation podcast. And we were talking about these things and how times change our perception of these things. But one of the ones he mentioned an artist to me who I hadn't come across, Sol LeWitt. I've just had to Google it quickly to remind myself. Sol LeWitt, American artist who was always very minimal. But then decided that his artworks, he sort of said, no, I'm going to distribute instructions, and that's what And you want to show a Sol LeWitt exhibition, then I will send you the instructions. And there's a lot of room for interpretation. Like put 50 dots and then connect them on a wall. So in other words, and then once the exhibition's over, you paint over it. And it makes the sheet music look positively staid and stiff. But the whole idea of what's the idea, as it were, behind this? What is it that we are selling? And exactly what you say about what people perceived as being the value or the normal idea. It's just like storytelling. Historically, I think people are surprised that the novel was one of the late forms of writing, because actually, if you want a long story, you go and listen to it, because the joy is in the storytelling. Poems, maybe we can write those down, because those can be easily distributed and you can read that for yourself.
Yeah.
But a big story, that takes a person, or a play or something like that. You have all these forms that go back thousands of years. Novel is really young, so novels are actually younger than patents by more than centuries. So novels are a really recent innovation, and that whole idea of like, what, a story in a whole story, not a short, but a whole, that seems really crazy. But that idea of music also, so there's an interesting thing that you mentioned the 50s and 60s. If we take it back to the 20s, there was a real thing about not having your work recorded, because there was a fear that somebody was going to take your money away, because basically you make life out of performance. And it turns out there's a whole piece of erasure, as it were, of women in blues. Women doing a lot of blues work in the blues songs. We always, when people say, 1920s blues musicians, Robert Johnson, that's because Robert Johnson recorded. But a lot of women said, no, you're taking away my livelihood if you record it. I'm about the performance. So that's where the money comes from. Money from bits of that seems there isn't a market for that. But they feared being recorded for very, very sound reasons. And so therefore there's a gap in the record, as it were. There's this gap that happens from the phonograph being invented to actually we understand how this kind of industry works. And there's a lot of people missing from that.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, because that's 100 years ago, and yet it is it's a very similar parallel to what's going on at the moment with Hollywood actors and studios wanting to license their likenesses so that they can produce digital simulations of the voices, faces, entire performances, all those kinds of things. And Peter Cushing for Star Wars Rogue One was the one that I remember when that came out, somebody said, well, yeah, the question you got to ask is it a digital Peter Cushing or is it a digital Moff Tarkin? Because Peter Cushing was a real man who's now dead, but Moff Tarkin is definitely owned by Lucasfilm. And the fact that he looked like Peter Cushing was just a limitation of the technology they had for realizing characters in the 1970s. And you're like, ooh, is that? Can you do that?
That's a provocative in every sense, intellectually and legally. Provocative way of looking at it, but that's really good.
So there's a comment, Marie's just talking about the art exhibition instructions, kind of gets to the border of art versus craft, which is something, something that I'm particularly interested in is... a lot of the stuff that I do for fun, and occasionally I don't get paid to do it, but I sometimes get paid to talk about it, is using incredibly technologically advanced solutions to do stupid things. Like, I created a joke programming language. So I have a recursive descent parser for a joke. And, that the joke wouldn't work without the technology. Yeah. But at the same time, it is an incredibly sort of, frivolous, almost a celebration of the fact that just because you can use tech to do important things doesn't mean you have to. And so, I'm really interested in the, art as a form of expression. Art as the best definition of art is something created by an artist. If there was no artist, there is no art. It doesn't matter what it is. Yeah. When ChatGPT or DALL-E spits out images, if someone just fed random prompts into it without any investment in it, then that's not art. But if the same person did the same thing because they really wanted to send their friend a picture of a llama eating a bowl of M&Ms, that's art. Because to me, that's the difference. That's the distinction. And so, the idea of Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that human element, because I was just thinking in terms of, one of the classics, mixtapes and playlists. Making up a mixtape for somebody because you love them. Or you're really good mates with them and you say, oh, you should listen to this. This is great. You're just copying other people's music.
Yeah.
But the whole intention, the whole packaging, the whole thing is, no, I'm doing this for a particular reason. Reasons of friendship. It's this isn't pebbling. This is rock. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
This is rock. I'm going to give you this because, we are mates, or, I love you and I really, so here's songs that, and the point there is that these are not your songs. It's not even you performing and reading the music. It's I am offering you this. And it's clearly a copy. And that's why, definitely beyond playlist, the idea of the act of having to sit there and tape it off something requires a certain amount of labor. And there is an art to that. And it's fueled by intention and an individual. But obviously, I could just as easily write a Python script to randomly go through Spotify and just, here you go. And it's just like, but...
We used to... There was a wonderful little overlap when... everybody had MP3s because they had internet and broadband at home, but certainly those of us on the sort of, the early postgraduate end of the income scale still had cassette players in our cars. And so we used to record MP3s onto tape so we could listen to them driving. And we got into the habit of we'd make mixtapes where the songs were, the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. You ever hear this? Yep. It's got a little piece of movie dialogue and then a song. We started doing that with other films. So we'd pick the quotable snippets of dialogue. We had one for Aliens, we had Mallrats, we had Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And we'd download the WAV files from like GeoCities and then splice them, record them onto the tape between songs. And, we had this one mixtape, me and my housemate who used to drive to work together every morning. We had this mixtape which was quotes from the film Aliens and then bits of Guns N' Roses and Metallica and The Doors. And it just worked so well. And, I
have not heard this, but I can hear it. That would absolutely work. I mean, that's a film fueled with quotes. Ditto Pulp Fiction. But with that music, it would absolutely work.
Yeah, it was great. So we had all these kind of fiction, like what if that had been the soundtrack? But to go back just to Marie's comment about art versus craft, there's something like making chairs is an example I often go back to, because making chairs by hand is, you can do it well or you can do it badly, but I think there is very little art in it. You take a chair and you're like, make another one of these, given the right tools and materials. And that, to me, that is 100% craft, because it's about knowing how to apply the tools and work with material to replicate a design that exists. But there's no kind of original expression. There's no decoration. There's nothing fancy in it. And, a lot of people made a living doing this for centuries of human endeavor, and many still do. There's a YouTube channel I've started watching called Big Skills, which is just, it's like guys in Lahore and in Karachi making stuff in roadside workshops with, bare brick walls and pouring things full of aluminium cans into a smelter so they can recycle it, so they can cast it, so they can make kettles and all this kind of stuff. It's just over and over again, and it's definitely craft, and I wouldn't consider it remotely art. They're just doing it to deliver a product that has a certain function. And at the other extreme, there's, I think instrumental music is the purest form of art because it achieves nothing. You cannot do any, even a painting, if you had to, you could use it to cover a hole in the wall. But instrumental art, it has no words, it has no meaning beyond what the listener kind of infers from the melody and the orchestration. And, it occupies no space, but it has to take time. And that to me is kind of the other extreme there.
I think that's at that point about taking time. The thing that just occurred to me when you said that is Alan Watts, hippie spiritualist of the 60s and 70s. He had this observation that we were talking about specifically about music and dance, but the idea is the goal is not to get it done. It's not delivery. It's like, right, the music. Let's play faster. Let's get to the end of the piece. Right, we've done that. You just mentioned The Doors. One of my favorite pieces is by The Doors is the end, which is 11 minutes runtime. And it's just like 11 minutes runtime. Okay, so we, to be more productive, we're going to play this at twice speed, or just fast forward to the end, and we are done. We've delivered. It's just like, no, that's not its purpose. And its purpose is, even if we play it at the right speed, it still doesn't actually achieve anything in the sense of a functional way.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just discovered that the concert hall has a curfew tonight, so we have hired 30 additional musicians so we could complete the Pastoral Symphony in 37 minutes. No.
Yeah, but you're right. In terms of the instrumental music, it is a good way of understanding that, and I think the fact that people. And I think that is one of the things that people are struggling to try and put into words, and don't even worry about legislation, but trying to articulate where they feel, oh yeah, this is okay for AI, but this is not, where the boundary is, and trying to articulate. It's surprisingly hard to do because we're not actually sure what it means in other contexts.
I mean, an interesting phenomenon that certainly, anecdotally I've noticed from talking to people is that this is a sweeping generalization, and you can pull it apart in the comments. The people whose jobs are threatened by AI hate their jobs. But those are the jobs they have. These are the people who they studied art because they wanted to be an artist, but they've ended up doing, Photoshop for advertising agencies to make a cheeseburger look really good. And on the one hand, that's their livelihood. That's their living. That's the way they've sort of found of being able to translate the expertise they have into revenue, but that's not why they did it. They did not become an artist because they wanted to Photoshop cheeseburgers. Musicians, session players who are like, well, I wanted to perform original music and write my own albums and tour the world, and instead I'm making jingles for insurance companies. And it's like, and that's how you pay your bills. And if AI takes over, you are going to have a problem. But that doesn't mean this is what you were born to do. This doesn't mean this is your life's calling. It's how you pay the bills. It just overlaps very heavily with your sense of identity because you get to, the same tools and the same process and the same craft, but devoid of art.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting, good way of distinguishing between these. I think that is, and again, we're back to what do we? For a lot of people, it's just like, well, what do we mean by that? And that goes back to these ideas. It's curiously enough, although people tend to rest on the originality, the question of originality, I tend to put it down to intention, which is actually harder to measure. It's much easier to measure the contribution of something and say, oh, it's about this percentage, this and that. That's measurable, hard but measurable. But intention, that's tough. That's a tricky one.
And it's interesting also the ways in which inspiration can form part of intention. Like there are there are odd little snippets where I'll be listening to a piece of music, and it's not that I want to copy the words or the melody or anything. It's that I hear a particular guitar sound or a particular drum pattern. I'll think, oh, that. I want to build something around that. And then I'll try to replicate it. And then once you replicate it, you're like, actually, I'll tweak it a little bit. And you end up with something that's unrecognizable, that nobody would be able to tell you where you got it from. But you definitely got it from somewhere. But, it's that sort of, intention of this has given me an idea, which is not just a facsimile, but the idea would never have happened without that inspiration, that input.
Yeah, and the problem is we can't even, because we've over-metaphored our use of things. The problem is we say, well, yeah, I was prompted by that. But that's the GPT prompt. This is a different kind of prompt. The ChatGPT prompt is trying to be a real-world prompt, but actually it's not. It's an input. That's what it is. We call it a prompt, but actually... it's not the way that a prompt exists in the real world, or the origin of that word. So it becomes difficult. It's curious. We're now going to find it hard to talk about certain things because we've already polluted the vocabulary by borrowing the words. We talk about training neural nets and things like that. It's just like, that's not actually training. It's just like it's kind of like it if you squinted it through an angle, and I wanted a word that was familiar to people, and I wanted to use a metaphor, but that's not training. That's not learning, and so on.
I did have a lovely example of a sort of convergent language this week. I'm doing an integration at the moment with a payment system that is only in Portuguese. There's no, it's the field names. The field names are in English, but the documentation is in Portuguese. The error messages are in Portuguese, and I got an error message from it which described the error as inesperado. And I don't speak Portuguese, but I was like, I know that, and I sort of I was thinking that means hope. Like espera is aspiration, it's hope. Yeah. So does inesperado mean it was a hopeless error has occurred? And so I went and looked it up, and no, desesperado is hopeless. Inesperado means unexpected. But in my headcanon now it is, sorry, a hopeless error has occurred, which, I can work with that.
Or abandon hope. I mean, it's like, I'm sorry this has happened. All hope is lost. You're the apocalypse here. But yeah.
So Stephen says we use way too many anthropomorphizing terms for AI. Well, AI wants to be anthropomorphized, Stephen. Who are we to deny it that? We used to call these. I mean, why don't we try this and kind of lift and shift vocab from the AI space into our regular developer space? So hey, your software is so buggy. No, it's hallucinating. Yes.
That's not a bug. That's a hallucination. Okay.
I love
giving me the wrong answer. Yeah, it's not true. Yeah, I don't have this much money in my account. You've lost my money. Oh, our banking system is hallucinating.
It's just a hallucination.
Let's try that one. Yeah, it's just like, see how far we get with that, and see if there's any pushback. I suspect there might be some.
But anyway, we are almost out of time. So one thing I should probably just clarify. So the title of this episode that I stuck up on YouTube is There's a Kevlin Henney on the Show. And it's occurred to me that there may be some people who are unaware that as well as being a living, breathing human thought provoker, Kevlin Henney it's a thing, isn't it? They crop up in the real world and people send them to you.
Yeah, it happened a number of years ago. I started being fascinated. I started with screenshots. Oh, PowerPoint is crashing and losing your work. I'd take a screenshot of that.
Yeah.
And there'd be a little dialog box that tell you that, there's a virtual function that's been called at this point and all the rest of it. So, they're using C++, they've not done this, and I can see what the DLLs are. So in other words, it's revealing its innards as it dies. It shows you how it was constructed in its death throes. And I thought this was fascinating. I occasionally put this up. And then we hit the era of the mobile phone camera. And I started taking a few pictures here and there, and I would show these at a couple of conferences just in the breaks or in workshops and stuff like that. And then people say, oh, I know you're interested. Send me some. And then we hit social media. Now people are just active. And it was just like I started resharing these. And sometime, I don't know, nearly 10 years ago, somebody said, oh, I've just seen a Kevlin Henney screen. at Bologna Airport. I remember it was 2016.
Yeah.
Somebody said that, and it just became a thing. A Kevlin Henney screen. So it's actually now become a thing. So people often say, "Yeah, it's a Kevlin Henney. It's a Kevlin. It's So my name is associated with failure. People won't remember me for technical neglect or anything, or other ideas. It's just like Kevlin Henney. Yeah, that's failure. That is.
Because I know people who are not developers who don't work in tech, but if they see like a blue screen of death on an advertising billboard, that's a Kevlin. Absolutely.
It's slightly bizarre. And I had a conversation with a couple of people this week, and there's completely different community, science fiction writers. We're hanging out, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, I know somebody. We bumped into somebody who knows all about you and stuff like that." And they said, "What? How do you know Kevlin Henney? You're not software developers." And he's about failure screens and stuff like that. It was just yeah.
Well, it appears that we have made it through the show with only one Kevlin Henney, which is the correct number for this show. So, Kevlin, thank you very much for hanging out with us.
Folks, thank you for having me here.
It's our great pleasure. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Those of you watching live, so if any of you is in London, I am running london.net tonight. We are at Fundaps in the new High-Low building on Bunhill Row. So if any of you is also going to be on YouTube now and then in central London in a couple of hours, come and say hello and we can have a beer afterwards and talk about the wonderful world of mixed media. If not, folks, you all have a good week. You take it easy, look after each other, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.